In this paper, I want to examine an idea that I think is at the heart of how we see ourselves and how we see our world. It's the idea of the state of nature. It's the term, as you'll know, used to describe whatever society might have been like before we came together under a social contract and formed civil society. And in the wider project of which this paper's part, I'm trying to argue that the state of nature taps into really fundamental themes of human existence, like anarchy and order and chaos and civilization and barbarism, and progress and decline and slavery and freedom. Themes, of course, that are very much alive and well in contemporary political and social discourse. And the state of nature is also a concept, I think, that helps us to understand contemporary approaches to environmentalism and the economy, and even, in fact, fad diets like the paleo diet. Now, Rousseau's state of nature is a really complex idea, obviously, but today I just want to ask one simple question to perhaps get at it in a fresh way. And the question is, where is Rousseau's state of nature? And I want to try and come at it this way because one doesn't have to read around Rousseau long to find out that an inordinate amount of time is wasted asking whether the state of nature is a real historical situation or whether in Rousseau it's hypothetical. And these are the two poles to which people tend to gravitate. And the more I've thought about it, the more that I've come to the conclusion that this is a really unproductive way of thinking about the state of nature. And it's got a tin ear to some of the complexities of Rousseau's text and the power of this concept of the state of nature. Collaterally, and in a way that may be useful for studying concepts beyond the state of nature, I'm also trying in this paper to elaborate a general way of thinking about concepts not as nouns, but as adverbs, and I'll come to that later on. Now, the most detailed work that's been done on this question of the status of Rousseau's state of nature is in an article by someone called Christopher Kelly entitled Rousseau's Peut-être, referring to one of the key quotes that I'll mention in a moment. And Kelly really helpfully identifies four possibilities. So Rousseau's state of nature is either a theoretical construct, it's a historical reality, it's a pure fiction, or the fourth option, and this is the one that Kelly prefers, it's what he calls an actual possibility, by which he means it's something that may well have happened, but may not have happened, didn't necessarily happen that way. And my jumping off point for this paper is that I think there's more to it than these options. And what I'm going to try and do by the end of the paper is lay out what this more is. But before I can do that, I think I just need to lay out the options as they stand so we can see what people have said so far. For most commentators, the state of nature sits somewhere on a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, there's straightforward historical reality. The state of nature really happened. And at the other end of the spectrum, there's straightforward fictionality. Rousseau's just invented it. And I'm going to call this the historical hypothetical axis. And at the extremes of these axes, there's two camps of Rousseau scholars. They've been called the Realists, who think that Rousseau is trying to make a claim about history, and the Rationalists, who think that he's not trying to make a claim about history. So first, the Realists. The Realists think that the state of nature really happened somewhere at some time. And reading Rousseau, they've got a point. The question, where is the state of nature, is really quite straightforwardly answered by Rousseau in his discourse on inequality. It is, he tells us, in the islands of the Caribbean, among the peoples that he problematically brands as sauvages. But the awkward point is that the rationalists, those who think that the state of nature is theoretical, also have material in Rousseau that they can point to. Rousseau seems to say in other passages that this state of nature is just a thought experiment, like the idea of a perfect circle or a frictionless surface. And this approach hangs on two main quotations. The first one is from the Discourse on Inequality, where Rousseau describes the state of nature as un état qui n'existe plus, qui n'a peut-être point existé, et qui probablement n'existera jamais. Seems straightforward enough. And then there's another moment in the text where he says « Commençons donc par écarter tous les faits, car ils ne touchent point à leurs questions. Il ne faut pas prendre les recherches dans lesquelles on peut entrer sur ce sujet pour des vérités historiques, mais seulement pour des raisonnements hypothétiques et conditionnels, plus propres à éclairer la nature des choses qu'à en montrer la véritable origine, et semblables à ce que font tous les jours nos physiciens sur la formation du monde. » Well, seemingly case closed. I mean, he's just said it is theoretical. So what are we to do then with these twin affirmations in Rousseau that have split Rousseau scholarship into these two camps? Well, something that some Rousseau scholars try to do is to situate themselves at a point on this axis between historicity and fictionality, sort of try to salvage some remnants of truth from the ruins of fictionality. The first group that tries to do this says that the state of nature is not historically true, but it is true about human nature. It's telling us things that are in fact the case about how we human beings are, so it's true in that sense. A second group tries to say that the state of nature isn't necessarily historically true, and this is Kelly's point, but it's part of what's been called conjectural history. It deals with what could possibly have been the case, whether or not it certainly was the case. Pressing on to, I think, more sophisticated and more satisfying readings, rather than trying to just split the difference of truth and fictionality, some people try and read the state of nature quite reasonably as an ideological construct. And ideology can run two ways in state of nature discourse. It can either bolster the current regime in which a particular text is written, or it can be subversive. And in Rousseau's case, it's subversive. The state of nature shows us living in civil society that things could be different, and in fact that things could be better. It teaches us to dream, linking in with the theme of utopia from the first paper in this panel. And another mode of ideological understanding is that the state of nature is a discourse of the modern West's self-understanding. It's all about us, not about whatever may or may not have been the state of nature. It functions, in other words, in the same way as Edward Said's Orientalism. It's an image of the other that the West projects outside itself and then uses to define itself against. The state of nature is something like an abject of Western and refinement and culture. It's the grubby banlieue in order to keep the pristine Western metropolis intact. Now, I don't want to dismiss these readings out of hand, but what I'd like to try and do is offer a different way of coming at the state of nature that I think has some things to recommend it that perhaps these other readings miss. And what hasn't received as much discussion up until now, and what I want to try and do, is to understand the state of nature as a lived experience, actually as our lived experience, in terms of what Paul Ricoeur would call a textual world. Or another way of thinking about it would be to understand the state of nature as a feature of our social imaginary. We can think about this in two steps, and this is the first one. The first one is to see Rousseau's state of nature as a world in Paul Ricoeur's sense. When he talks about the world of the text, and what that means is that it's something that opens up in front of the text and discloses, according to Ricoeur, a new mode of being into which the reader can step. It refigures our world by taking us out of it momentarily and reintroducing ourselves to our own world, changed by having been in this other world. And I think that's really powerful, but I think it's limited because, according to Ricoeur, this only takes place in terms of texts. He talks of the world of the written text, the words on the paper. But I don't think that captures what the state of nature is doing in contemporary society. And so we need to broaden Ricoeur's idea of the world of the text. And I want to do that through introducing the notion of figures. Figures, not just in a literary sense, figures of speech, but patterns or rhythms that can be encoded, yes, in literary text, but also encoded in other ways, encoded in concrete just as much as in concepts, patterns and rhythms that are encoded in institutions just as much as in ideas. And I want to suggest that the state of nature is actually embedded in these different figures that we encounter in society today. Concepts like the state of nature are figured in our buildings, for example, in the architecture of our smartphones even, in our cutlery, in our laws, in our intuitive sense of time and space themselves. So the state of nature then is an aspect, I'm arguing, of our social imaginary. And Rousseau's state of nature, understood as a pure, balanced way of life that's been to some extent corrupted and distorted by civil society, that particular idea of the state of nature is figured, I think, in, for example, the incorporation of green spaces into modern suburban design. It's figured in myriad adverts and packaging for any number of products, from shampoo to shaving cream. All these products that promise us a pure, balanced, natural way of life if we'd only buy and use them, and promote this purity and this balance as self-evident virtues. Of course, we would want those things. I think Rousseau's state of nature is back of those sort of ideas. So asking then, where is the state of nature? It's not just a question about discourse. It's not in Rousseau's texts. And it's not even like saying, where is the Merchant of Venice? It's more like asking, where is justice? Which I guess in our society is everywhere in general, inflected in institutions and relationships and objects, but nowhere in particular such that we could say, here is justice and not over there. But I think we need to still push this analysis one step further, because it's not good enough, I think. It doesn't hold up to say that the state of nature is in this object or in that institution in some isolable way. And this is why we need to draw on a second sense of figure to understand the state of nature, the figure of the figure and ground relationship. Figures, in terms of figures and grounds, don't resonate in a vacuum. They're part of lived experience. They're part of perception. They always occur in a relationship between a perceiver and a perceived, not in an object abstracted and isolated from its context. And indeed, the same object can present different figures to different people. One person's progress, for example, is another person's Orientalism. We're predisposed, we are conditioned to see particular figures against particular grounds. So then, I'll ask again, where is the state of nature? Where we've got to is that it's everywhere, but it's everywhere in between. It's in the networks, or what Max Weber calls the webs of significance, of interactions that make up the wonderfully myriad cultures in which we live. It's not something we see out there in the world. It's something we see through. It's a lens that focuses the world for us. In other words, it's more like an aspect than an object. It's a way of seeing and experiencing everything rather than something out there that we experience. The state of nature, if you like, is more of an adverb of experiencing rather than a noun that's experienced. And it makes little sense, doesn't it, to ask for the location of an adverb. Asking the question, where is slowly, it doesn't make any sense. So either then as something that configures us or as something that we resist, the state of nature inflects how we think about the environment and how we think about people from combinations of cultures different to our own, and even how we think about our shampoo. But it won't do, this is my argument, simply to discuss whether the state of nature in Rousseau is a historical and geographical reality or whether it's a hypothetical thought experiment. Because this misses the crucial point that the state of nature is in fact a constantly present absence for us. It's a figure that rhythms and patterns our lived experience in micro and macro ways, but by not being here, by being somewhere else. And the approach that tries to dichotomize it into, is it historical or isn't it, misses the point that the state of nature unfolds in a world that refigures our own, not only through language, but through all manner of relationships and institutions and objects as well. So then, for one final time, where is Rousseau's state of nature? Well, it's here, but it's here in the mode of not being here. Or in other words, it's a non-place that places us. Thank you.